Hi everyone, my name is Laurel Gillig, and for today I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on a podcast that I had to listen to. The Women, and it's over the novel that we're reading in class, The Women of Color, with Professor Carrie Sinanen. So to start off, I just wanted to provide the link to the podcast because I think it did a great job at explaining the novel and providing a lot of thought-provoking questions and ideas, a lot of which I'll be sharing today as well. So, a little bit about Bonnets and Dawn. First, the podcast does specialize in literary works written by anonymous authors that get lost throughout time, especially for women of color. The main speaker's name is Laura Burke, and the host is Hannah Chapman. And for this podcast, they brought Professor Carrie Sinanen for her expertise. So, to start off, the speakers of the podcast did provide a very brief summary, and I'm not going to give any spoilers, so don't worry. But the first person narrative revolves around our heroine in the novel, Olivia Fairfield. Um, Throughout the story, she writes her first letter on a ship to her governess, and she essentially is performing the Middle Passage in reverse. She's being sent back to England after her father passes away. Mr. Fairfield does express in his will that Olivia can be his heiress if she moves to England and marries his cousin, Augustus. She tells the story of her life and how her mother was an enslaved woman named Marcia who fell in love with her master, Mr. Fairfield, who is Olivia's father. And the speakers of the podcast touch on this for a while because they talk about how Olivia is a product of a very complex love between Marcia and Mr. Fairfield, because essentially Marcia is in love with her master, and Olivia is that product of a very complex love story. And while giving birth to Olivia, Marcia does die. And in Olivia's mind, she still views Marcia as being a captive. On the ship, Olivia does meet two people, Mrs. Honeywood and her son. And then the speakers kind of go on to analyze some different parts of the novel, a lot of which I'll be talking through today. So, first, the podcast talks about how they expected a lot of the examples of racism to be very shocking and unfamiliar with what we see in our lives today, but they comment on how relatable actually the examples of racism are to our everyday lives. And one thing that I think that is important to note is how Olivia in this story is not an enslaved woman. She is a free woman who is trying to navigate life in a very different environment from what she grew up in. Olivia is used to her life in Jamaica and being around people of color. Then she goes to England, where she's around predominantly white people, and she has to constantly stay on guard, ready to defend herself. And she actually does quite well in strategizing on how to handle these moments of blatant racism. Another point that the speakers of the podcast make is they talk about who exactly the author is. That's kind of a really big mystery with this novel, is because she's anonymous or he's anonymous, we don't necessarily know if they're a woman of color. Is there any hiding going on? And the speakers, from what they gather, they believe that the author captures the struggle of a woman of color so well that they do think that the author does have to be a woman of color herself. Another point that they make is how the discussion of Caribbean enslavement is absent in America, but it is really important to see that representation in literature for everyone to have some sort of understanding. And a quote that Laura Burke said that really stood out to me is she said, "It is important to see representation in the literature, not only for people of color, but I think for white people as well, to know that we've always been here. We're not new." And I think that that was a great quote because a lot of the time, narratives tend to get buried, especially for people of color. And it's important to kind of remind us that though these narratives are being buried, the people and the ideas that come associated with it are not new. They've kind of just been buried by what we teach in our own curriculum. Another professor brings up a debate ongoing about Olivia. Um, because they had wrote an article saying that even though Olivia faced racism, she technically wasn't enslaved, so is she really part of this African American narrative? And that was an article written by another professor at a different school, and obviously the speakers in this podcast definitely disagreed with that. And Burke explains that this mindset is how narratives get lost in time, which I think is absolutely true. By kind of putting down one narrative and saying that it's less important than another narrative is in a way completely erasing history, because at the end of the day everyone has their own story on how they kind of navigate life through their own struggles dealing with racism and things of that sort. Synanon also discusses how she has a Facebook group on how this novel should be taught in literature classes more often, which I definitely have to agree, because it provides a lot of historical context, it provides a lot of background for what was going on during this time period. And they do bring up the film Belle, because there are a lot of correlations between that film and The Woman of Color in regards to historical details and a lot of background information. The speakers of the podcast also discuss some imperfections of the novel. The primary one being how the impact of the novel is being a little hindered by the formatting. I'm sure we all noticed that, at least in my copy, the format was a little bit off. I definitely don't think it was enough to take away from the novel itself, but it could be distracting to some people, just because of how everything is kind of spaced out. But that was really the only imperfection that they really saw with it. They followed that by saying that, rebuttaling those imperfections, saying that there are a lot of great passages that provide insight to what life was like during that time period for women of color. And throughout the novel, Olivia Fairfield is being treated as if she's a piece of property, which brings a lot of significance throughout the story and even at the end of the story. The speakers of the podcast also touch on Jane Austen, specifically her novel Mansfield Park, as they were written in similar backgrounds. I haven't read Mansfield Park, but they do touch on that a lot and how there are a lot of similarities. And one thing that they said that really stood out to me is how they know that the novel written by Austen, who is a white woman, has survived over time, but how a novel written by a woman of color, really giving their own personal narrative to that story, has not survived and essentially has been forgotten about. Which leads them to then saying that the literary canon is political. A lot of the great books that we see are written predominantly by white people. And while a lot of these works are great works, they also don't provide the diversity of different insights and perspectives, from other people as well. And in a way, that's kind of how we end up burying these really important narratives that could provide us a lot of historical context and a better understanding. To conclude, I have my own personal thoughts and questions after listening to this podcast. Something that the podcast made me think of is how interesting it was that this book was very difficult to find. It was not very accessible. I had a difficult time finding it in bookstores. I couldn't find it even on like my e-reader, which leads me to questioning the reason why. Is it because the novel didn't have an author? Is it the format? Or is it a way to bury a narrative in time? How does a book like this get reviewed and then forgotten over time? And I think it's important to kind of sit on that question, because as a country, I think that we have to do a better job at bringing up these literary works that were created in a time that offer different narratives and perspectives. And by burying those over time, I think it makes us a lot less understanding. So I definitely think it's important for even a novel like this to be taught in literary classes, because it provides a different context, it provides a different perspective. And overall, I really enjoyed listening to the podcast and gaining some insight on it. But thank you so much, and I hope you'll have a great day.